In my imagination as a child, they were very real. I remember being up above the site where the blackberry bushes are, and it's crowberry, so it's low-growing bushes. And we'd be out picking berries, and I remember thinking, now, if you see those sails coming? And I remember we standing there, a bunch of us looking and scanning the horizon and says, if we see the sails, we've got to make a dash for home. We can't go too far. Because if those sails comes over the horizon, we got to get to home. In some ways, I envision Eric being like some of my old relatives. You know, tough as nails, never say die, never give in and admit defeat. You know, I find the stories fascinating because they're a glimpse into our whole human past. And you look at those sagas and you can still get evidence of the fact that they're human. They have the same sort of wants, needs, desires that we do. Yep. And that's what I find especially of interest.
Welcome to Saga Briefs, where we're looking at the stories behind the sagas. I'm John.
And I'm Andy. In our Saga Briefs, we address things that turn up in the sagas that we then arbitrarily decide that we want to spend a little more time on.
Arbitrarily? We've got 3 or 4 of these in production right now, because there are actually all sorts of things we want to talk about. But it can be tricky finding the time to actually finish one, especially during the academic year. We're both kind of buried under our work at the moment.
But fortunately for us, this episode was already recorded some time ago.
Right.
I know we mentioned in the Greenlander Saga episode that John spent a couple of weeks this summer in Canada, making his way out to Newfoundland and the Vinland settlement site known as L'Anse, aux Meadows.
Now, I know I've said this a few times over the past few months, but I really recommend this trip for anyone who can get there. Newfoundland's a beautiful place, and L'Anse aux Meadows is a World Heritage Site for a reason.
Well, I mean, aside from providing pretty conclusive evidence that Europeans landed in North America centuries before Columbus, it's also the anchor point for 2 sagas.
Well, I think most people are probably more impressed by that pre-Columbus thing. But for us and for the sort of person who listens to this podcast, the saga part's pretty exciting.
Yeah, and before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about this trip and how it came about?
Okay. So, I initially hoped to take this trip with you, but you bailed on me.
Yeah, well, you know I wanted to go. We talked about it. But I was finalizing my tenure portfolio, and between that and the stress of the whole tenure process, it just wasn't going to happen.
I know. I still say it would have been a great Saga Thing road trip, but I understand.
Yeah, it would have been.
So after you bailed on me, I decided to make the solo trip up to L'Anse aux Meadows. And I reached out to the Parks Canada service to see if they might be okay with me bringing a microphone along and asking the interpreters at the site a few questions.
Yeah, I mean, we had been talking about this trip for a while, and we always thought it would be a cool thing to interview someone from the site. I don't know that we thought carefully about what we would interview them about exactly, but that's what we wanted to do.
No, we did not.
But what we had in mind then was an informal sort of thing, just kind of sitting down with someone and asking about the Vikings in North America and maybe getting a few pearls of wisdom about the archaeological dig that Helga and Anna-Stina Ingstad conducted in the 1960s.
Yeah, that pretty well covers it.
But first, you had to get there. So, John, how was the trip itself? It's hardly a hop, skip, and a jump for either of us.
It was amazing. It was a little hectic at first. I drove with my wife and kids for the first part of the trip. And we hit New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia over the course of a week. Then I headed for Newfoundland on my own.
I have often considered ditching my family at a rest stop, but I've never actually done it. Did you, peel out somewhere near Halifax while they were in the bathroom or something?
It was tempting, but no. My wife took the kids on a flight to Wisconsin to visit her family for a few days.
Well, at least the Newfoundland part of the trip must have been a lot quieter than the rest of it.
It was, yeah. But Newfoundland is also just amazing to drive around it. I mean, I keep saying this to people, but it's like Iceland and Alaska had a giant island baby.
What?
The landscape is beautiful, and there's a lot of it.
A giant island baby? What are you talking about?
You'd have to see it. I'd show you the pictures, but due to a complete motherboard failure on my cell phone, I don't have any.
No, of course not.
The pictures that I sent you that went up on the Saga Thing Twitter account and a few that I sent to my wife are the only ones that survived.
Wow, so that's a total of 3 for me and maybe 2 for your wife?
And like another 2 for her.
Wow. Anyway, that should be a lesson for you to back up your pictures on the cloud.
No. I'm not even sure what the cloud is. And anyway, I tried backing up my computer file. It didn't happen. So I don't want to get into that whole sordid tale.
All right, so you're driving through the giant Alaska baby landscape, I guess.
Don't be snide.
What happened?
So the drive up Newfoundland is over 450 miles, and this is after an overnight ferry trip. 450 miles of driving. And I took the western route on what's called the Viking Trail, which took me up through Gromorn National Park. The entire drive is pretty damn scenic, but the views all through Gromorn are really astounding.
So the highway's called the Viking Trail.
Yeah.
I mean, now I really want to go there. So what happened after you turned up, probably looking fairly rumpled after over a week in your car?
Well, as we said, I was thinking very informally about maybe asking someone a few questions when I got to the site. Instead, I got a taste of the hospitality and friendliness that Newfoundland is famous for. From the first call I made, everyone I talked to was eager to help, and they actually turned this half-formed idea of me showing up and asking questions into a full-fledged interview opportunity.
Now, before you explain that part, I just wanted to digress for a second to say that the Ingstads had a similar experience when they arrived at the L'Anse aux Meadows site. There were, I think, 13 families living in the community in 1960, and the undisputed leader of that group was a man named George Decker.
Right. Now, George is going to be important to our story for a couple of reasons. I want to actually read Anastina Ingstad's journal account of her first meeting with him. We hadn't been on land but a few minutes before we saw a small group of people come walking along the shore. A little yellow dog ran in front, followed by a man who looked to be in his 60s. He waved to us with his stick and yelled out something or other. Behind him followed a crowd of children of all ages. This was the first time I met the man who was to become our best friend in all the years to follow, George Decker. His whole stature radiated personality and authority. At first glance he appeared rough, with his weather-beaten face and dark stubble, but in his deep brown eyes shone warmth and humor, and he was quick to smile. Right from the beginning, Helga called him Big Chief, a name which George liked very much, and by which he came to be called.
Now, who wouldn't want to be called Big Chief? I mean, that's a great nickname.
It really is. But the point is that the Deckers and the rest of the L'Anse aux Meadows families just opened their homes up to the archaeological team, and it actually became part of the dig over the next decade.
Absolutely.
So when you visit the site, there are still people there who were around during the excavations, and they all remember the Ingstads with great fondness. And when you read the journals and the reports from the Ingstads and from Birgitta Wallace, it's clear that they all came to think of L'Anse aux Meadows as kind of a home. The result is a community that's embraced and integrated the site in a way that feels really natural and unforced.
I really need to visit there.
You really do.
Yeah. But we were going to talk about what happened when you showed up, so tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, I could wax rhapsodic about that trip for a while longer, but we'll get to business. So what happened is that several members of the Park Service went far out of their way to manage a connection for me with Loretta Decker, who's an officer with Parks Canada. She's also an expert on the L'Anse aux Meadows and Greenland sites, and as her name suggests, she's also the granddaughter of Big Chief George Decker.
And as the interview will show, she's a pretty remarkable person with an intimate knowledge of L'Anse aux Meadows.
Yeah, that's right. Her family owned the property on which the archaeological digs took place, so she lived through nearly every stage of L'Anse aux Meadows' evolution from an archaeological curiosity to a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Yeah, she's led a pretty amazing life.
She really has. I just want to say, I will express my gratitude to Miss Decker and to everyone else involved who made the conversation possible. The interview was conducted in Rocky Harbor, which is a few hours south of L'Anse aux Meadows, and the people there were tremendously helpful too. They even helped me find a room for the night in town.
That's very generous. Wow. All right, with that introduction, are you ready to do this?
Absolutely. There isn't much left for us to do here. Hit the button, let's get to the interview.
Okay, here we go.
So I was actually born when the Inkstead excavations were ending and Parscana ones were beginning. So it was a real transition. The Inksteads had excavated all of the house sites and some areas around the buildings, but not a lot. And when Parks Canada came in, they excavated the house sites again to confirm all the information, and then they did some areas at around, including the area in front of the buildings where they discovered the boat building area. So, having grown up in that time frame, I heard all the stories about, the Vikings, the raids, the Blood Eagle, the red and white striped sails.
Right.
And I can remember as a small kid sitting under the kitchen table because my father started working at the site when he was 16, Loretta Decker.
Gee.
When the Inksteads asked for help, my grandfather said, okay, take him. He's the youngest one. Take Lloyd. So Lloyd worked at the site from his time he was 16 until he retired because of health conditions.
Wow.
So he worked at the site, and our house was filled with archaeologists and plotters and excavators of all types. And I remember sitting under the table listening to the stories and being frightened clean to death. Me and my sister and our cousin Jim, the three of us, under the table, trying to avoid being found because we wanted to hear what they were talking about.
And while they're talking about blood eagles
all
and
stuff.
being beheaded and
yes, all those things, and of course our family sharing ghost stories. The French and, all those things. And I remember being up, and I wish we could be at the site, I would show you, be up above the site where the blackberry bushes are. And it's crowberry, so it's low growing bushes. And we'd be set as kids to go pick berries. And there'll be, 10, 12 of us at least. And we'd be out picking berries, and I remember thinking, now if we see those sails coming. And I remember we standing there, a bunch of us looking and scanning the horizon and says, if we see the sails, we've got to make a dash for home. We can't go too far. Because if those sails comes over the horizon, we got to get to home. Because look what they did.
Yeah.
We couldn't understand. We were too young to understand the era and the time frame. Right. And we couldn't understand that they could live in those little low mounds. But we knew what they were. We knew about the Vikings. And we were afraid of them. We were,
Yeah. Hey, you share that experience with 300 or 400 years of Europeans.
Exactly.
You see the sails run.
Exactly. The quotes about the Vikings overwintering. And I really could feel for them because in my imagination as a child, they were very real. It's very exposed. When you're up in the hill, you can see way, 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 way out in the distance. You can see over to Labrador. You can see the Belle Isle and some other islands in the area. So you can see for vast distances. And when you're down on the site level where the buildings were built, the same thing really. You can look out across the Labrador. You can see distinctive colors with different vegetation on a good many days. It's always windy. And you have those rough, craggy cliffs like you'll see in Greenland. And in fact, when I was in Greenland, it struck me that the really only differences between L'Anse Meadows and Greenland was that L'Anse Meadows has some stubby evergreen growth around that whole site, and whereas Greenland did not.
Right.
Same plants, very, very much feels like that same physical environment, so very similar to what you'd see in Greenland.
So does that explain the choice of that site then? Because, you sort of look at the site itself, and if it's so exposed and it's so, it's going to be brutal in the wintertime, and it's, I'm sure it is still brutal in the wintertime. I happen to be visiting in August, which is lovely. But other sites that might be more secluded, might be more protected, maybe wouldn't have that same feel, or?
That may have been some of it. I mean, I think there's a certain comfort level in having that same landscape and climate. You know the animals, you know how to interact with the landscape. But I think part of it, in a strange way, was security. Because as you come into the fjord, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they probably never realized that it was a gulf and not a fjord.
Right.
This is sort of the first point of land you hit. So this is sort of your base camp, your pit stop. This is where you can set up, you can develop your camp, your gateway site, and then you have the rest of the territory to hop off from there to go out to. And it's also pretty easy to find for ships. I mean, when you come into the Straits, you cannot avoid seeing the Strait of Belle Isle. You cannot avoid seeing those other islands, Warren's Island, Great Sacred Island. There's a ton of landmarks in that area there that would be easy to describe and easy to find again.
So it's a fairly forgiving site then for the navigation of the time.
Oh, for sure.
It's going to be hard to miss.
It would be tough, really tough to miss. Because if you look at a map of Newfoundland, the Great Northern Peninsula, it's right out there in the middle of the ocean,
right.
You know, sticking right out like a thumb. So they would have had to find it.
Which leads me to the next question, the obvious question. So why did it take us so long to find it? Because, of course,
everything's in Newfoundland.
Nobody knew where it was for, 900 some odd years.
For sure. I think the grapes were the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the grapes, the whole idea of grapes.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I know there's a number of theories about that, and there's been debate over the years, and I actually grew up in the middle of that debate over grassland versus vineland and, you know, those things. But I think because of the grapes and knowing that grapes would have not grown any further than, you know, Maine, maybe New Brunswick with the riverbank grapes, that eliminated the Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland.
Right.
Pretty quickly.
Right.
But, you know, but that's where it is. And I know they would have easily found grapes, but they would have found grapes as a consequence of actually going further south.
Right.
And going deeper into what they thought was that fjord.
Right. Now, the Ingstads actually refer to this, that things like nuts and grapes and so forth are found on the site that would have come from much further south. Right?
I think when I look at artifacts, I try and make them make sense based on human behavior. We're not going to try and make things more difficult for ourselves. You know, so on the site at L'Anse Meadows, there were a number of butternut fragments found. And there was also a butternut burl. Those butternuts grow, for example, in the Miramichi area of New Brunswick. And the butternuts and the riverbank grapes both ripen in late August. And in the Sagas, they talk of cutting down grapevines as a cargo. Probably what they were cutting down was, you know, spruce, fir, birch, whatever is growing down there. But the riverbank grapes grow up those trees. And if you don't actually have in-depth first-hand knowledge of what grapevines and grape trees look like,
right,
you may not realize or understand that you're cutting down a spruce or fir that just happens to be loaded with riverbank grapevines.
Right.
You know? And I've never had fresh riverbank grapes, so this is secondhand knowledge. But I've always been told, I've seen lots of photos of them, I've always been told riverbank grapes don't make good wine.
Oh, yeah?
You know, it's been compared to, you know, your 325 Screw Off the Cap University vintage.
The Mad Dog.
They're dry. They're dry. They don't make good wine. But, you know, I don't think good wine as much as alcohol content may have been their primary concern.
And you can make alcohol content.
They will ferment. They will ferment. You know, and the butternuts themselves are fascinating because, of course, nuts would have been valuable as a fat source. Right. But the shells themselves make great dye. You'll get a very deep...
Is that true?
Yeah, you'll get a very deep, rich brown dye from butternuts.
Huh.
I accidentally discovered that. It's already traditional knowledge, but I wasn't aware of that. Somebody brought in a big bag of butternuts for the site, and they were really dirty. And I said, okay, I'll wash them first. And that way, you know, we'll let them dry, then we'll put them in the huts. And the whole sink, my hands, the water, everything turned brown. Because they really do make good dye. So they would have been valuable for that.
Sure.
Well. And
absolutely.
I don't know if you've ever dealt with butternuts, but you have to process them in a certain way, and they would have essentially been boiled for the fat, and the fat would have been scooped off the top.
Oh, I see.
They're very hard to crack, unless you have a special technique.
Like going to the supermarket and picking them up. And
Our technique was involved in basically an hammer.
Right.
You end up with butternut mush.
Jeez. So this is actually the story of a married couple,
Yes.
The Ingstads,
Yes.
right, and how they discovered the site. Tell us about it.
She was actually the trained archaeologist, Anastina, and he was, I always say he was a Renaissance man. He was a lawyer. He had been a governor for this remote island for Norway. He had been a trapper up in the high Arctic, living with the Aboriginal people and trapping with his own dog team. So he had done many, many things.
Oh, wow.
He was especially interested in finding Vinland.
Mm-hmm.
And he read the Sagas. He studied the Sagas. He studied the Holt map.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it would have been the Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland. That was his theory.
So he worked that up before he even started doing site work.
He did.
Wow.
And, they had excavated in Greenland, looking for the type of thing that they would potentially find in Vinland. And she was very methodical in her research, and there's lovely photographs from their collection of some of the things they found in Greenland. But they came to the Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland, and they started asking in various communities if anybody knew of any old ruins. And my grandfather, George Decker, lived in L'Anse, Meadows, and a cousin of his in another nearby community said, well, go to L'Anse, Meadows and talk to George Decker. They were very patriarchal, and our family was the first year-round settlers. Grandfather was sort of, the chief of the community.
You guys were the first ones.
First ones.
Wow.
So anybody coming in would have to go sort of, talk to grandfather first. So when they came in, according to what, my family's story, when they came in, he said, oh yeah, I know where that is. Follow me. Went up over the hill to our pasture land and said,
just casually.
Here it is.
Oh, right. It's right here.
Yeah. Now, we always, in our family, they were always called the Indian camps.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there were Aboriginal people there before the Norse, and again after the Norse, but no one in that same time period for about, 300-500 years or so. A gap there. So, when the Ingstad saw it, as he said, it could have been a number of things, but he had a feeling that this would be the right thing.
Wow.
They were very damaged and fragmented because, of course, all the longhouses had burnt in the Viking period. So, but as they started following the shapes, they could make out doorways, make out walls, see individual rooms. And when they started excavating, of course, they found the layers of sod, sand and gravel in the middle, evidence of benches, the central fire pits. And then they started coming up with actual Norse artifacts, like the bronze pin.
Yeah.
I mean, the bronze pin was, definitive proof.
Right.
That this was base camp.
See, this is tremendously gratifying to me because on the site before I've made the comparison of the wetus, of the longhouses of the northeastern American Aboriginal people, and Viking longhouses, and that they look very similar.
They do,
and they have a kind of very similar structure.
Yeah.
And not everyone has agreed with me that that's that is a comparison to make. So I'm very glad to hear that you can that looking at admittedly a very degraded site, you can sort of see where it might be one or the other.
I think you give human beings the same sort of climate conditions, the same sort of natural resources, they're going to come up with the same solution. And the solution is, in that case, about 4 feet of peat, about 2 feet of sand and gravel in the center as central drainage, about 4 feet of peat again, and it's occasionally tied across through the sand and gravel so the two walls are connected. The posts for the roof are set right into the sand and gravel, and the layers of sod go right on top of the sand and gravel, and that's sort of a built-in drainage system. So when it rains, water runs down the pitch of the roof and goes into the sand and gravel core of the wall. And the sand and gravel core of the wall conducts that to the ground, but it also absorbs moisture from the sod in the walls when it's very wet, and it releases moisture back to the sod in the walls when it's very dry. So it keeps the sod in the walls relatively healthy. So, you'd expect, 15, maybe 20 years out of a sod house. You have 3 hulls. There was likely 3 ships at the site at any one time. One hull was quite large. It was the biggest by far. And that was probably Leif's house. So he's the head of the expedition. He has the biggest house. One in the middle of the complex actually is smaller. And, maybe a captain didn't stay there. Maybe they did. It's debatable. And then you have another series of a long house and some outbuildings right on the other end. For the most part, you had, young guys who were hired to come here. Yeah. They wouldn't have been wealthy people. Right. Even life himself wasn't super rich. Right. And it was a logging camp. Mm-hmm. Essentially, that's what it turned out to be. It may not have been the intention in the beginning, although I do think it was.
Well, certainly Iceland and Greenland, both places where a ready source of lumber was worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you've been to Iceland and Greenland, both of the places as I've been, and I'm struck by a lack of trees. Yeah. Now in L'Anse and Meadows, there's no tall timber, but you just go around the bay,
right,
and you'll get spruce and fir of considerable size.
Sure.
So yeah, you come here, you work for a couple of years, you fill the boat with timber. And you bring it back home.
Well, and that's Greenland Saga says right away, right?
I mean, look with Freydis. Freydis and her husband
First
burning.
thing she does.
Freydis and her husband burning her timbers for the house.
Yep.
So that was a crisis in her life because how are you going to build a house now with the timbers?
Right.
Because even though the type of sod houses that they built and started to build in Iceland and moved on into Greenland building require a limited amount of wood. You still have to have those big timbers to hold up that roof. Absolutely. And you still have to have considerable size sticks to be the frame for the roof underneath before you place the sod on.
Well, and that's even without considering if you want a ship, right? If you want to maintain your ship.
If you want firewood.
Yeah.
If you want tools.
Yeah.
Because you have to have the handles for the tools.
Mm-hmm. And now, on the site, they've actually reconstructed some of this.
We have. We've reconstructed them many times, in fact.
Well, right. That's what I was going to say. Maintenance on these has to be constant.
It has to be constant, but it's constant in part because of our own problems. We, in the beginning, when they were built in 1972, we had, engineering blueprints to follow. Mm-hmm. And we used cement for the bases. We had all the poles set in cement, and it was very, very engineered. Mm-hmm. Well, natural material doesn't respond well to engineering. So, we had cement in the middle of the walls where it should have been sand and gravel. Of course, the sod cakes. It just bows out because it's not getting that moisture transfer. Right. And, so we have had to make some changes over the years to how we have built the buildings.
You have to be a bit humble and realize that they knew what they were doing and you don't have to improve on it.
No, exactly. And you have to realize that these are temporary structures. Mm-hmm. You can't say I have a sod house still standing from 1972.
Right.
Because they can't stand that long. Right. You have components from 1972. You have the foundation from 1972. But, 15, 20 years. Mm-hmm. And we also learned a lesson that I was expecting to learn. For years, we had the open hearths, the wood fires in the middle. Mm-hmm. So a few years ago, for various reasons, one of which our staff were getting smoked to pieces, we switched to propane.
Oh.
Well, when we switched to propane, all of a sudden, you don't have all that soot being produced by the fires.
Sure.
And because you don't have the soot being produced by the fires, you start to get mold.
Oh, gee.
And you get rot. The rot picks up. Uh-huh. It happens a lot faster. So now we have to have, after hours maintenance fires with real wood and lots of smoke to resolve that issue. Again, they knew what they were doing.
Right. As you said, you put people in the same conditions with the same materials and they're going to come up with the same solution because it works.
And for years, when we were there with the wood fire, you had to sit. You couldn't, when you get up and start walking around, you stirred up the smoke. Mm-hmm. So when people would come in, on most days, we'd invite them to take a seat and hope they'd sit quickly because the smoke is just above your head level when you're sitting. If you're up walking around very much, you're stirring the smoke up.
Jeez.
But, it's part of how they live.
Yeah. So now when it comes to recreating this stuff, it sounds like there's a lot of archaeological stuff that goes into this. Now, does the saga material enter into it at all? Or is that just sort of something that exists alongside the site and doesn't really inform the attempts to rebuild the site?
Well, a bit of both, maybe. Mm. We have tried to recreate the buildings as we expected they would be for the purposes they are defined as having in the sagas. They're sort of temporary structures. Mm-hmm. They're probably only there for a couple of seasons at a time. and then it's a long period of being away.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the ones we've created. We have done them in the way that the archaeology on the site says they would have been done, with also some information from the Sagas saying that these wouldn't have been elaborate halls and big chieftain buildings. They were relatively humble structures. Only the main rooms had wood planking on the walls, and they would have been relatively simple. So it's a bit of both there.
Right. Well, because the sagas suggest that there's housing for, in the Greenlander saga, 100 people, thereabouts. In Eric the Red saga, even more than that. And the site is a little bit more contained than that.
We haven't reproduced everything.
Right.
We've only reproduced the long hall. We've reproduced essentially what was the first building built on site, which is now, it was a temporary structure. It probably never even had a roof in the original. We actually had to have a roof because of our own, modern standards for construction. We have that one, and we have the slave hut. So we have one group of 3. Probably, the Sagas probably exaggerated the number of people that could have been housed there. Right. Maybe anywhere from 60 to 90. And that includes floor space. Now, part of our modern sensibility is that if we're camping, we're not all bundled together in a tight group.
Right.
You have your own personal space, buffer zones.
Right.
I don't think that would have been part of what they were considering.
No.
And there's also lots of debate about, of course, how they slept. Did they sleep sitting up? Did they sleep fully reclined? So there's that.
Right.
And how you would actually prove that, I don't know. But definitely the floor space would have been used. And we just finished last season the slave hut. And it's the one that's sort of pear-shaped on the original site. That's just been done. We don't have it set up yet with all the material inside of it yet. But that one is particularly interesting to me because when it was found, they were debating about whether or not this was a sheep pen or, an animal enclosure. But in the original site, there were stone slabs at the back wall and a fire right in front of it. So you're not having a fire when you have. But when you go down to the site and you look at that room and see how tiny it was, But so we have taken information both from the Sagas, but also from the archaeology. And
so you're saying my chances of finding a uniped?
Well, you could do self-service uniped.
That'd be great.
There is a sword there.
It just be disappointing to me not to go all the way out to L'Anse Meadows and not find a uniped. You guys have, there's other things going on as well. I know when I was reading up on the site, a few years back they had a recreation ship.
Yes.
That actually sailed across the ocean and made it to the same site.
Several.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And it's we've had the Snorri.
Yeah.
And in 2000, I think there was 10 ships that came from various places in Scandinavia came to the site for the 1000th anniversary. And there's always some sort of project that's happening over Scandinavia. One of my ambitions, because in visiting Bratteli and realizing, the connections that were there, one of my ambitions is to have an iron pot made at L'Anse Meadows, donated to Bratteli for their fire.
Do you guys have metalworking on the site?
We do.
Oh, wow.
We do. We have a Viking age trained blacksmith. And he gets the visitors involved in it. And, at the site, we know they were making nails. And they were smelting iron from the bog iron. It may have been just an experiment to see if they could get it to work, but it was definitely a technology they were using. That's how they were getting their iron. And we do have abundant bog iron ore at the site.
Yeah.
All around where they were building the buildings. All along the perimeter of the brook.
Is he actually using bog iron from the site?
We can't take it from the site. It's UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But we have had special events where they have done the smelt. And in fact, in the exhibit, you will see a piece of a bloom from a smelt about, I guess, 5 years ago now.
Wow.
Where they produced iron and they had the slag running and, you could see in real life how this looks. And you can look at the artifacts and say, yeah, this is like pretty close. Jeez. It's almost like you're running lead in some case. You know, it's molten rock, bits of iron, essentially glass because of the molten sand. And, you know, it's all bubbles and moves. And so quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, and we've got a number of descriptions of what one of these, the bog iron smithy would have looked like. Right? I mean, we were talking about Eil's saga before we started recording, but Eil's father establishes a smithy and brings up his gigantic stone that 4 men cannot lift.
That's right.
And uses it as sort of the anvil for his smithy.
Yes.
So we actually have some idea as to how that process would have worked and what it would have looked like and so forth. That's great.
In L'Anse Meadows, it was a pit building. It's actually dug right into the side of the hill.
Yeah.
And then it's just a roof on top, and it was open in front. Now, in the reconstruction, of course, we don't have the side of the hill, but we've done our best to recreate what it would have looked like. And again, we have on the original site evidence of where they had built a stone kiln and had lined it with clay, and you know where the channel was cut for the slag to run out, and all that stuff. So lots of fascinating things. And of course, it's across the brook from the rest of the site. You actually have to cross that little bridge that we have,
which makes good sense when you're messing with fire.
It does.
It's like the old idea of putting the kitchen in a separate building from the rest of the house.
Exactly.
Right? This makes good sense.
Exactly. And, you know, I mean, we do know that the large halls burned. And they burned when the wind was blowing from the west. Great wind to get out of the site. And, you know, there's lots of debate about why they burned, how they burned, who burned them. But looking at the buildings and knowing that they were cleaned out, that anything of value was taken, I'm on the side that they burned them, saying either when we come back we have to restart,
right,
or we're never coming back. No one else is using these. You know, so I don't think it was an accident for all the large houses to burn, the halls to burn, and the small outbuildings to not.
Well, in both the sagas, and again, you know, to whatever degree we can trust the sagas, again, you know, Unibeds, but they both suggest that they leave under difficult circumstances.
Exactly.
Which, of course, you know, in some ways shows better sense than other European settlers who came later, where you sort of look around and say, you know, we're outnumbered here and they don't want us.
That's the no one else using them part, right?
Right.
That's the no one else. That's no one else benefiting them from the part. And in the sagas, it seems that they create their own problems because they attack, people sleeping under the canoes and kill them all but one. And, you know, when I was a good many years ago, I actually asked an archaeologist, so does this sound like something they would do? Does this sound like, why would they...
Burning the buildings?
No, why would they kill people sleeping under a canoe when they weren't being attacked? They could have passed on by and probably never had a significant encounter with them. And her response was, that probably would be. And her explanation at the time was, it may have been a test. Because, you know, if you kill someone with an iron tool, that proves whether or not they're mystical beings or supernatural beings or, you know, actual humans. You kill them and say, oh yeah, well, that's a human. Okay, so we know what we're dealing with. So I don't know. I mean,
well, that's Greenlander saga sort of comes down more on that side. They sort of show up and just start killing right away. Eric the Red saga actually seems to suggest that they do a bit more trying to trade, and although both of them suggest, and this maybe also falls in with the burning the buildings when they leave, they're very careful not to trade technology.
Exactly.
If they trade milk, they trade food, that kind of thing.
And they probably trade the worst thing they could ever trade with milk. In my opinion.
Right.
Because I think, with that one, I think why the trouble started was because they traded milk with people that hadn't drank milk from the time that they were weaned from their mother. So if you haven't drank milk ever since, I don't know, 1,000 years ago when babies would have been weaned.
Right.
But if you haven't drank milk for perhaps 15 years, 20 years, and all of a sudden you drink a large quantity of pure goat's milk, you're not going to feel well in a few hours. I would not expect.
No.
Most people would not. So now you've had this fabulous, it's like going out and having a fabulous big piece of cheesecake. and being up all night sick. You know, I paid $15 for that piece of cheesecake, and now I'm sick. So it's, you know, I gave them all these furs or fish or what have you for this food, and now I've been sick. I've been cheated.
Or poisoned.
Right? I always sort of look at the normal human interactions. That's what I would think now.
Yeah.
I can't see why they would think any different, just because it was 1,000 years ago. And I really think that's why, in part, the trouble started.
Yep.
Because the Norse were traders.
Oh yeah.
You know, they would have had an inclination to trade, certainly for stuff that they couldn't have gotten otherwise.
Right. Well, it does seem like they're doing very limited, hunting and so forth.
Yeah.
And so bringing in the furs and so forth to trade, that makes a lot of sense.
It does.
And it's the Norse way of doing things.
It is.
Right? That
it is.
You've got something, and you sort of turn that into everything you need.
That's
rather
right.
than going out and doing all the work yourself.
That's right.
You find someone else who's already done the work, and you trade with them.
That's right. And you trade with them, maybe the goods that you trade with them, unbeknownst to them, are more valuable in somewhere else. So you bring that somewhere else, and then you gradually trade up.
Right.
You know, it's like taking, a pedal bike and trading up to a car that people do today, right? It's sort of that same thing, right? Only it's in our history, in our past.
Yeah.
I find in looking at the sagas and hearing the stories about their encounters with Aboriginal people, that I would expect that would have been a lot of sort of fear and reluctance on both sides in the beginning. And the battle descriptions of, pulling out the breasts and beating it with the sword and all those things.
Right.
I can see being terrified of maybe seeing this woman come out and be ready to fight.
Right.
You know?
Well, and it does suggest that it is, and Eric the Red Saga in particular, that both sides are terrified.
Yeah.
Right? That we have this description of this wailing weapon.
Yes.
That the Aboriginal people have.
Yes.
That the Vikings
whistles over their head and they flee.
Right.
And then Freda stands up and...
Right.
Yeah.
So both sides are sort of, they're not sure where they stand with the other group, and they have reasons to be afraid.
Oh, I agree. And these are not the warriors, the Vikings that are coming to L'Anse.
Absolutely right.
These are,
Thorfinn Karlsefni is a tradesman. Right? He's a shipping magnate.
A shipping magnate with a bunch of young guys who are landless, second, third sons, farming family descent, who are looking to make a better life for themselves and are hired on essentially as laborers, loggers, what have you, for a period of perhaps 2 or 3 years. Yeah. They're not trained warriors. They're not fighters.
Right.
I mean, I know that they would have had some basic understanding of how to protect themselves. Right. But they're
probably more trained than you and I.
Probably more trained. Well, you wouldn't have to be trained much more trained than me. But, probably not great at getting into a formation, forming a shield wall, being able to protect themselves effectively. Like a group of, professional warriors would have been. So these are not the raiders. These are the traders.
Right. And they react like traders when the violence is happening.
They do. They flee to the hills.
There's a lot of running in every direction.
That's right. First man goes down, they're off. Right. But in the old exhibit that we had, it was the original school in L'Anse. It was they turned it into a museum. And there was an audio booth, and it was an old picture from National Geographic from that book in 1972 that shows the Norse and the Skrælings fighting. And, the black hair waving and the painted faces and, the sticks with the stones sticking out of them and all those battle scenes. And it was an audio booth. So you go in, you press the button and you listen, and it was the wailing and the fighting. It was so impressive of the time, this battle, right? And it had it was so frightening. That was a big part of that original exhibit for me. I can just barely remember what the picture looked like, but this whole battle. And probably, in fact, they wouldn't have met Aboriginal people at L'Anse per se, but they may have encountered different groups. They may have encountered people coming down the coast of Labrador.
Sure. And
they probably encountered, very likely encountered people in the second location that the sagas speak of. Hope.
Is this the one they think they may have found at Baffin Island then?
No. In the sagas, it talks of, Strumfjord, Fjord Occurrence, Leaf's camp. Then it talks of a second site called Hop. further south, which was essentially a
yes.
summer camp. Probably in the New Brunswick area, Miramichi area, New Brunswick. That's our sort of working theory. And they would have definitely encountered vast numbers of Mi'kmaq people there. You know, and they were already living there. This is their territory.
Right.
And I'm not sure how fond they would have been of having a bunch of white guys show up on the shore.
Right. Well, and you wonder, I mean, so far, nothing's been found of that site, and you wonder if they ever were able to create permanent structures down there, or whether they were sort of operating, sleeping on the boats and, you know, being ready to flee at any moment. Or
I think at the very most, they would have had boots, small temporary sod shelters.
Yeah.
That would just take a few days to build.
Yeah.
And maybe not even that. Part of the problem would be, of course, that the further south you go, the quicker it's been developed along the shoreline.
Right.
And who's going to stop development of a housing complex or a road because you find sod?
Right.
You know?
And especially with modern excavating tools, who even knows when you found sod?
No, exactly. Now I think too, we live in a very disposable society. You're replacing your phone every 2 years. You know, your earbuds are worth 6 months use, and you buy a new set. So you're
spotted that, did you?
You're constantly discarding possessions and replacing them.
Yeah.
I mean, I have hundreds of books.
Yeah.
That's not how these people live.
Yeah.
You had clothing that you needed, and you didn't have possessions that you were laying down and walking away from.
Right.
Because everything you had was valuable. And you're not leaving a trail of trash behind you of empty drink cans and chip bags and all those things. Right. Everything you're using is organic, and it disappears easily. You know, and when I was doing tours years ago, visitors used to ask, so why did they not leave, anything else behind? And I used to say to them, so you've sold your house, you're moving. You're going to leave your couch, your VCR. That tells you how old I am. Your car in the garage. You're leaving all that behind because you've sold the structure. How does that make sense? You take everything you have of value out with you. And this is what they would have done. Even more so because, the only things found on site at L'Anse Meadows, a known Norse site, was garbage and things I lost.
Right.
The bronze pin being one. And that was lost in a forging pit where they were making nails. So he may never have realized where he had lost that bronze pin.
Right.
And, just got buried in charcoal and just never found it.
And that's cultural as well. I mean, it's, I'm thinking of comparing this to the site at Vinland in England, when the Romans pulled back from Hadrian's Wall. They left, comparatively, a massive amount of material behind. But it was a bureaucratic society. They produced a lot more in the way of records and paper and so forth for their own use.
Yeah.
And so when they left, they, of course, were just sort of flinging this stuff behind them.
Yeah.
And frankly, were a society given more to leaving a mess behind. But culturally, the Norse traveled light.
Yeah.
They had a history as a nomadic people. They were no longer at this point nomadic.
That's right.
But had that history of a nomadic people.
Yeah.
And that's a culture that doesn't put a hammer down and walk away. Right? You know where your things are, all the more so because you don't have many of them.
You don't have many of them. And, the people here at L'Anse Meadows would not have been wealthy.
Right.
These are, as we said earlier, these are, for the most part, hired labor. I know people romanticize the Viking era, but, their medicine was very crude, almost non-existent. Life was very, short and dirty and brutal in some cases. You lived in houses filled with smoke. You had to work extremely hard just to keep yourself and your family fed. Starvation, poverty, all that stuff was ever-present threat.
Any surprise they're willing to drink bad wine?
That's right. So, they're not running around with golden breastplates and huge winged helmets.
Right.
They're farmers, trying to get their family fed and trying to live just like everybody is today.
Yeah.
Only they're doing it, in a different way.
Yeah.
They're living on the land, living on the resources. I really find it fascinating when I read about, graves and what was offered to the dead, and I look at their houses and see how they lived, and it's quite fascinating. I'm not impressed by, big ships and things like that. That's not what fascinates me. It's how people lived, how they lived day to day, what they did to make each day pass successfully. How they raised their children. How many children lived beyond 5 years old?
Right.
And how they raised them, what values and stuff like that that they gave their children. So I find that quite interesting too. And of course, Snorri, in the sagas, it talks about Snorri being born.
Right.
There may have been many children born, as in 3 or 4, we don't know. But if you
He survived.
But he survived.
Right.
But if you have a crew of, say 50 men and 7 or 8 women, you may have had several children born that were born to slave women, but they would not have been mentioned in the sagas because they're not important.
Right. Or may not have survived.
Or may not have
Difficult
survived.
circumstances.
May not have survived for true various circumstances, difficult or otherwise.
Well, and, this has led to that, which I think now is largely discredited, and rightly so, this point of view that people in the Middle Ages just didn't feel strongly about their children because they were so likely to lose them. But then you look at something like Egil's Saga, where he's writing the poem for the loss of his sons, right, and trying to die because of the pain that he feels over losing children. And that's not, these were not people who took the loss of a child lightly.
I don't think you can take a loss of a child lightly.
No.
I don't know, maybe it's my bias, but especially for women. I mean, you go through childbirth, you're breastfeeding by no choice at that time.
Right.
So you have to bond with this infant.
Yeah.
You know that there's a great likelihood that this infant may die.
Yeah.
Through all the little common childhood illnesses now that essentially it's a minor visit to the doctor. But how can you not bond with them?
Yeah.
It means it's natural to bond with them.
Yeah.
And to teach them what you know. And then to, especially the males, pass them over to their father when you're about 8 or so to, learn what they need to know outside your household.
Yeah. Now, there's that one beautiful story in Vatnsdala Saga, Thorkel Scratcher. And Andy's going to love that I'm talking about this because Thorkel Scratcher's a favorite of his.
Okay.
But Thorkel is exposed. He is the illegitimate child of a member of the Vatnsdal clan. And the wife refuses to have him in the household. And so he's exposed. But he's rescued by a great uncle, who is set up to do this by his brother. Because his brother knows that, the great uncle has been suffering from berserk rage. And the day he finds the child, he never has another rage. Because now he knows he has to be calm, he has to be present for this child, and it cures him of berserk rages forever.
Wow. And
he sort of takes on care of this baby, and that immediately sort of puts him in a very calm place. And to me, it's always been this sort of beautiful little story about the effect that babies and adults have on each other.
Yeah.
And that was true in the 13th century, in the 10th century,
I would agree,
in the 20th century.
I would agree.
Yeah.
And when I look at some of the Tudor stuff in relation to Red Bay and looking at working on costumes based on what we know the Basque Whalers wore, and then looking at some of the publications that very, very credible publications that have been put forth about the same period of very wealthy families, and looking how elaborately they dressed their children, the jewelry they made and all this stuff to fit a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
But then comparing it to the Norse and knowing they did the same thing. I read an article a few years ago about a grave that was excavated, and it was a small female child. And she actually had little mini turtle brooches in the grave with her.
Oh, wow.
So as a toddler,
I
think they thought she was about 2 to 3 years old. As a toddler, she already had her little turtles and the bees.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, she's valued.
Yeah, of course.
Because they create some special ones just for her size.
Right.
So, I find the stories fascinating because they're a glimpse into our whole human past. And you look at those sagas, and you can still get evidence of the fact that they're human.
Yeah.
They have the same sort of wants, needs, desires that we do.
Yeah.
And that's what I find especially of interest to me.
Yeah.
They're not, sword swinging, horned helmet barbarians, destroying monasteries.
Well, you get that too occasionally.
Right? You get the human aspect.
Right.
And, I know in later years, of course, as Greenland's economy failed and people left and, they descended into a mini ice age, I know that it must have been a terrible, terrible place to be.
Yeah.
Stuck in an ice age without ability to build ships, without the ability to get out. Having less and less and less heat. I went to an archaeological conference a number of years ago. And one of the things they talked about in Greenland was in the beginning of the settlement, the heat-loving insects were found around the kitchens, and the cold-loving insects were found in storage areas. And as the time progressed, the warm-loving insects got less and less and less. So the cold-loving insects progressed to the point where they were actually living in what should have been the warm areas of the building.
Oh, wow.
So that was one of the things that they used to indicate that these people are suffering.
Yeah.
They're not even having enough firewood.
Well, we've talked about this a couple of times on the podcast that, it's really within one generation in Iceland. Right? Yeah. They come over from Norway, a heavily forested place, and they essentially try to treat Iceland like Norway.
Yes.
Right. So they chop down all the trees they can find to
right.
build their buildings. They
That's
begin by building these very wood-based buildings.
Yeah.
They're building wood-based structures all over the place.
Yep.
Within one generation, they go from probably something like 30 to 60% forested to 1% forested.
That's right.
And it stays that way.
That's right.
And so even by the 10th century, it is in Vatnsdala Saga. There's a moment when Ingemund is moving over to Iceland, and he visits King Harald, and Harald gives him a ship filled with lumber as a parting gift. And it's a princely gift. Right? I mean, not only the ship, but the lumber. Right, is a massive, and even though the saga writer is trying to tell us about Iceland as the sort of land of milk and honey at this time, the fact that that's the gift you give him suggests that already we're looking at a place where the wood is hard to come by.
Deforested right away.
Yep. And you end up, especially then you get into the mini ice age in the 13th, 14th century. And boy, it must have been difficult.
And then volcanic activity on top of it all.
Right.
It had to be, especially in the later years in Iceland, it had to be, in Greenland, sorry, it had to be a terrible way to live.
Yeah.
This farmer lifestyle that you're built to live, you can't live that lifestyle in Greenland.
Right.
And I've always found it fascinating, and it may just be, it may not actually bear out in evidence, but I've always found it fascinating that the Norse in Greenland didn't learn from the Aboriginal people living there. Mm-hmm. And I've always found, and again, through conversations with various specialists and stuff I've come across, the theory that was, always sort of discussed was the fact that the Norse were Christian and the Christian church would have discouraged them from being involved with non-Christians in any meaningful way. Mm-hmm. So they may not have been able to learn the hunting techniques that the Aboriginal people were using because they would have not had a lot of contact with them.
Right, because they convert in the first generation.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. And in Greenland, of course, it's the ring seal. So the Aboriginal people are hunting them through the ice. Mm-hmm. And it's a different type of hunting technique. You have to, you have to learn that.
Yeah.
And so it's a whole different way of living.
Well, and we know, even just looking at, again, I'm always going to go back to the sagas. You look at Eric the Red saga, and when Leif accidentally ends up in the New World, right? Because in Eric the Red saga, it's much more sort of in
it's planned. Yeah.
But he gets back to Greenland, and he's there to convert people.
Yeah.
He's been sent by Olaf Tryggvason
That's
to
right.
convert the Greenlanders.
That's right.
And nobody wants to talk to him about conversion.
No.
They want to talk about this land full of food he's just
Yes, that's right.
because they're already kind of, they're already living hand to mouth.
Yes, that's right.
You found a place with food and you came back.
To here?
Show us where that is, and we will convert to whatever you want.
That's right. That's right.
But then from the very early period, it was
Yeah.
clear that they were struggling.
Yeah, that's right. It was. And that it was always going to be at best a very poor existence. I mean, Eric made, in Newfoundland we have a saying. It's Eric made a rod to whip his own ass. True as temper, Eric created a situation where his family could not survive.
Yeah. He ran out of Europe.
He ran out of Europe to fight in. Exactly.
Yep.
And he ended up going to Greenland.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really think it was a con job by calling it Greenland, because Greenland is very, very green.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't really live a European lifestyle there
Right.
without outside support.
Right.
And I often said to people, the Norse started coming to L'Anse Meadows when they were new in Greenland.
Mm-hmm.
They'd only been there for about 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
So really, they were still setting up their Greenland colony.
Right.
And I think at that point, they may have had an inkling that things are not going to go well.
Mm-hmm.
But, you're fighting on, you're saying, no, we're going to get resources, we're going to make this better, and all this stuff. So they started coming to L'Anse Meadows when they were pretty isolated, before they became part of the European Trading Union for that time period. And they got the main resources they needed, was wood. Fur and all that stuff, that was well and good, but wood really was what you needed.
Yeah.
To build houses, to build ships, for everything. It's the plastic of 1,000 years ago kind of thing. They stopped coming because eventually all the Europeans started to realize Greenland has these exotic northern goods to offer, the narwhal tusks, unicorn horn kind of thing, and the furs and the polar bears and all those things. So for a while, they had walrus hide rope. I used to tell visitors years ago, anybody who sails knows walrus hide rope is the best rope you could get. So of course Greenland could produce that, and you had all these traders coming into Greenland, bringing wood, bringing spices, news from home, all these other things that you could not get in L'Anse Meadows or North America as such.
Right.
And in turn, the Greenlanders were producing very valuable goods that they could, their economy and their land. But when that ice age started, the traders couldn't get in. You can't live on polar bear.
Right.
Or walrus hide rope. That's no substitute for wood.
Yeah.
Or iron.
Yeah.
And
that was the end of it.
That was the end of it.
Yep.
Yeah, within 500 years.
But I think that's a key point, is that it wasn't easy at any point during those 500 years. It just they'd stuck it out, by God.
They stuck it out.
And,
really, I don't think they really had any choice.
Right.
It's not as if they could have called Iceland and said, "Okay, we're ready to come home now.
Right.
Come and get us."
Well, by the 15th century, Iceland's not having a great time either.
No. Right. And so, what do? You can't get off Greenland.
Right.
You're not having any reliable contact with the outside world. You're stuck where you're stuck.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's live how you can live.
I also wanted to ask you about just what's happening with the site right now and in the future. What are the plans? I mean, so right now, it's at a kind of point of, you feel like you've got a pretty good sense of what the building materials are, what the site looked like. It sounds like you're still expanding on the buildings that you're putting together on the site. What's the future of the site? Are there any plans for more digs, or you feel like we're now in the phase of restoration?
The archaeology itself, I think, we can consider pretty much complete. The site is about 90% excavated.
Okay.
So it's the house sites in the area out around. So we've learned about how the buildings were built, the general functions of each room, We know where wood planking was. We know where benches were. And we know we have evidence of storage and things like that from barrel rim impressions and things left in the floor. Mm-hmm. And we know where the boat repair area was because, of course, when we excavated, we found, over 2,000 pieces of wood. Yeah. As for reconstructions, I don't know. The door's not shut there. Yeah. I mean, we're currently on a project now to repair the ones we have. It's sort of a continual thing. Right. It's every lovely lady needs an occasional lift, and this is what we're doing. We may build more in the future. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. So, it's a very active site. I mean, it's so popular with families coming in, with Viking enthusiasts, we get so many people who come in and say, my ancestors might have been here. Mm-hmm. We get so many people that are descended from, Norwegian or Swedish immigrants to the United States. Right. We talk about their grandfather had a chest that looks just like that. Okay. And I can remember my grandmother, these elderly ladies. I remember my grandmother doing that because some of the ladies do knoll bending, which is the one needle knitting. Mm-hmm. I remember my grandmother doing that. Can you teach me how to do that? So it's a real connection to their family and their ancestry. Right. And I don't know I can't see other sites sort of having that same sort of connection that L'Anse aux Meadows does, because of course L'Anse aux Meadows is the only Viking site in North America. Right. Right. And you get a lot of people coming in that want to explore that part of their heritage. Right. We can fuss and fight and bother about our moments of life, but there's that cycle of life repeats itself over and over again, no matter how much we struggle.
Well, isn't that what something like L'Anse aux Meadows shows people, too, right? That you can have this sort of settlement that exists for one moment in time. Yes. And yet can be this hugely important. I mean, think about the international importance of that site. Yeah. But so in your father's lifetime, it goes from being the old Indian camp to a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Exactly. Right from our pasture land, it was a pasture. Yeah. My great-grandmother was a bit of a freydas. And nobody was allowed to go through the pasture land. So that probably in big part saved it from anything because it was valuable pasture grazing land. And it went from that to being a big source of employment for people when the Inksteads came. Sure. Another source of employment when the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs came, which eventually became Parks Canada. And still a continued source of employment, plus UNESCO World Heritage Site. 30,000+ visitors come to the site a year. Wow. And it's meant a major business for the bed and breakfasts, the hotels, the restaurants. There's all kinds of spin-off economic benefits from it. Right. From a little field in a place called L'Anse aux Meadows that now has about 21 people.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for talking to me.
You're welcome.
This has been lovely.
Thank you.
So that was John's conversation with Loretta Decker, Parks Canada officer and L'Anse aux Meadows expert.
I once again want to thank Loretta, as well as her colleagues at Parks Canada, Jane Brewer, Dale Wells, Kim Vokey, and some other people whose names I'm certainly forgetting at the moment. It was a pleasure to meet them all, and I hope to run into some of them again next time I make it up to the site.
Maybe I'll make the trip with you next time. I mean, visiting L'Anse aux Meadows is very, very high on my list of places to visit in the coming years.
Definitely.
Yeah. Oh, and I'd also like to give a quick thanks to my wife, Wendy, who helped me in the initial stages of editing this interview. She put a lot of time in and deserves some praise for helping me work out the structure of the interview and acting as my sounding board with the various edits that I made afterwards.
And we also owe a special thanks to Andres Campazano and his band Andanza for the use of the song Runetal at the start of this episode.
Yes, and if you like the song, you can follow the link provided on our website to the song and Andanza's music. This was my first foray into asking for permission to use the song, and I think it went exceedingly well.
Where does all the other music for this episode come from? Where does all your music come from?
Well, most of the stuff in this one is just snippets of songs I had on my computer from Creative Commons websites and a few other odds and ends. I tried to stick within fair use time lengths. But I should note that most of the music we use in our podcast comes from the Creative Commons website by Kevin MacLeod called incompetech.com. Now, I've usually got that info built into the episode MP3s as I'm supposed to, but we should start acknowledging what we're using a bit more regularly and including links.
Well, that would be the responsible and probably the legal thing to do.
Yeah, I thought so. So here we go. Now, there's a lot of good stuff on that site. So, like I said, I'm going to provide a link to anyone who's interested in mining it for their own projects.
Okay. I think that wraps up our saga brief.
Indeed it does.
All right, we'll be back in a few weeks with our judgments for the Saga of the Greenlanders.
Now, I wonder if you'll rate this one as high as you did Eric the Red Saga.
Yeah, I wonder who either one of us can possibly pick for a thing man. It is slim pickings in the Greenlander saga.
It sure is. But we will all have to wait until next time to find out who has what it takes to join our thingman. So until then, thanks for listening.
Bye for now.
Ólafur reið með björgum fram, siglir mann, nýtt hann fyrir sér álvaran, var rauður loginn fram, líðan lagið fyrir undan björgunum, líðan lagið fyrir undan björgunum fram.
So is ale your favorite?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I
kind of got that impression.
because every woman loves a bad boy, I guess.